All right, today we're going to dig deep into the foundations of ancient Indian society. We're going to uncover the brilliant engine that powered its villages and its kingdoms, creating a thriving world thousands of years ago. So, when you think of ancient kings, you picture these huge armies, these magnificent, opulent palaces. But have you ever stopped to think, where did the money for all that actually come from? It's a really basic question, but the answer reveals a system that's surprisingly modern.
Well, the answer isn't what you might think. It's not just about conquering new lands or looting treasure. It was rooted in a really clever, self-sustaining economic engine that was incredibly sophisticated. Let's break down exactly how this thing worked.
Okay, so the whole thing was built on this really simple but super powerful loop. It was a cycle of investment and return that connected the king's treasury directly to the success of the smallest farmer in the village. Let's walk through it, step by step. It all kicked off with the king. See, a smart ruler back then knew that the real wealth of their kingdom came from the land. So they made the first move. They invested money into building crucial infrastructure. Things like new wells, canals, and water tanks, projects that would totally change the game for agriculture.
And wow, the payoff for that investment? It was almost immediate. With a steady, reliable supply of water, farming was no longer this huge gamble against the weather. All of a sudden, crop production became way more certain, way more bountiful, which meant there was a consistent surplus of food.
And that surplus, that's the key to everything. For the first time, farmers could consistently grow more than they needed just to get by, and that newfound security meant they could reliably pay taxes to the king, holding up their end of the deal. And boom, that's how the cycle completes. All those taxes from all those farmers flowed right back into the royal treasury. The king's revenue shot up, and now he could fund those armies, build those amazing palaces, and, get this, even reinvest in more irrigation projects, starting that powerful cycle all over again.
Okay, but an economy is just a concept, right? It's the people living inside that system that really matter. So, who were these people? What did their villages actually look like? Let's zoom in on the social structure.
Let's start down south, in what's known as the Tamil region. What we find there is a society that was pretty clearly split into three different groups.
So, right at the top, you had the Vellalar. These were the big, powerful landowners, the wealthy elite. Then you had the Uzavar, who were the ordinary plowmen, the everyday farmers out there working the fields. And at the bottom of the ladder were the Kadaisir and Adimai. These were landless laborers, and that even included slaves who had to work for others just to survive. A really clear, and you can bet, a pretty rigid social ladder.
All right, so now let's head north and see what's going on there. The setup was different, and it all centered on one incredibly powerful person.
And that person was the Grama Bhojaka, or the village headman. This guy was usually the biggest landowner around, and the job was often hereditary, passed down from father to son. But he was way more than just a rich farmer. He was basically the king's guy on the ground, responsible for collecting taxes. And on top of that, he often acted as the local judge and even the policeman. Think about it. It's like being the mayor, the taxman, and the chief of police all rolled into one.
But of course, the village wasn't just the headman. You also had the Griyapatis, who were smaller farmers who actually owned their own land, independent folks. And then, just like in the south, you had the Dasa Karmakara, the landless men and women who had to work on other people's fields to make a living.
So, you might be wondering, and it's a great question, how on earth do we know all this? These specific names, these social structures from thousands of years ago? Well, the answer is pretty incredible, and it lies in the historical records that somehow managed to survive.
A huge amount of what we know, especially about life in the South, comes from something called Sangam literature. These are some of the oldest writings in the Tamil language, dating back about 2,300 years. They're like a time capsule, a priceless window into this ancient world. And why the name Sangam? Well, the name itself tells you something really cool. Sangams were these big assemblies, kind of like conferences for poets. They were held in cities like Madurai, and it was in these massive gatherings that this amazing body of literature was written and put together. So yeah, it's all thanks to these ancient poets and their work that we have such a clear picture of what life was really like.
So let's wrap up with this thought. A central government invests in public works to boost the economy, which then brings in more tax money to fund the state. It's a cycle that was humming along in ancient India thousands of years ago. But doesn't that sound familiar? When you really think about it, how different is that from the basic economic ideas that many governments still operate on today?
All right, today we're going to be historical detectives. We're on the case of a 2,500-year-old mystery, What was it actually like to live in an ancient city? The trail has gone cold for centuries, but the clues are out there, so let's see what we can dig up. And this is the central puzzle, isn't it? We hear all about the kings, the queens, the epic battles. But what about the regular folks? The person running a shop, or cutting grass, or making pottery? Their world seems to have just vanished. So where do we even begin to look? Well, right off the bat, we hit a major roadblock. Most people back then built their houses out of stuff that just doesn't last. We're talking wood, mud brick, and thatch roofs. Unlike giant stone palaces, these everyday homes have pretty much dissolved back into the earth over time, leaving almost nothing behind. So, if the buildings are gone, what's next? Well, our first clue isn't something we can dig out of the ground. It's something we can listen to, the stories people told each other. These stories are called the Jatakas. And what makes them so incredibly valuable is who told them. These weren't tales spun by kings or generals. Nope, these came from ordinary people, talking about their lives, their hopes, their clever ideas. And thankfully, Buddhist monks thought they were important enough to write down, preserving this amazing window into the past for us. So let's check out one of these stories. It starts with a young man in a city who is completely broke. The only thing he has to his name is a dead rat. Yeah. Not exactly a promising start, right? But this story is all about being clever. Just look at this hustle. He starts small, selling that rat for a single coin to a hotel owner for their cat. Then a storm hits. He cleverly offers to clear the king's garden of fallen branches, getting a huge pile of firewood for free. He uses his earnings to provide water to grass cutters, who pay him back with bundles of grass. And finally, he sells all that grass to a horse trader. You see, the story isn't really about a rat. It's a fantastic look at the commerce, the ambition, and the sheer cleverness of everyday city life. Okay, so stories give us a sense of what people were thinking, but what did their world actually look like? For that, we turn to our second clue, where ancient artists literally carved their world into stone. Take a look at this. It's a piece of a sculpture from a site called Sanchi. And notice, it's not some grand portrait of a king. It's a busy, crowded, lively city scene. If you look closely, you can see the different buildings, what people were wearing, the hustle and bustle of the street. It's basically a photograph, frozen in stone for 2,500 years. And these artists were carving these scenes on public buildings, on railings and pillars where everyone could see them. They carved everything. Scenes of life in the city, in the villages, even glimpses into the forest. In a way, they were the photojournalists of their day, giving us an incredible eyewitness account of their world. All right, we've got stories and we've got art, but what about actual physical stuff? For our third clue, we have to get our hands dirty and see what archaeologists have managed to dig up. And you know, they found some really strange things. At many of these ancient city sites, they've uncovered these mysterious stacks of ceramic rings, piled one on top of the other, almost like a well. They were found inside individual houses, and for the longest time, nobody could figure out what they were. I mean, really, what were they for? Why would a regular person have one of these strange stacks in their house? The answer, it turns out, is surprisingly practical, and it tells us a ton about daily life. These ring wells were basically the ancient version of modern plumbing and waste management. They were used as toilets, as drains for wastewater, and even as garbage chutes. All of a sudden, we get this clear picture of how an ordinary home dealt with sanitation 2,500 years ago. Pretty neat, huh? And here's something that tells you a lot about their priorities. While those individual homes made of mud and wood are long gone, archaeologists have found the massive, sturdy fortification walls that surrounded many of these cities. It shows you what they invested in to make it last. Not necessarily private comfort, but definitely communal defense. So now we've got our three main clues: the stories, the art, and the artifacts. Let's put all the pieces together and see what kind of picture of their world starts to emerge. And just look at how perfectly this all fits together. The stories, the Jatakas, they tell us about people's inner lives, their ambitions, their smarts. The sculptures give us the visuals, what the cities looked like, how people dressed. And the archaeology fills in the practical, day-to-day details like sanitation and defense. Each clue by itself is just a fragment, but together they build a really powerful case. And that's really the big takeaway here. We can solve the case of the vanished city. We rebuild that lost world not from one magic clue, but by weaving together all these different threads. It's that combination of story, art, and artifacts that really brings their world back to life. So we've seen the kinds of clues they left behind for us. And it kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? Thousands of years from now, what clues from our world are going to survive? What will the historical detectives of the future make of our social media posts, our plastic bottles, and the stories we tell today? What will they think of us?
All right, let's talk about ancient economies. And I mean, forget whatever dusty image you might have in your head. We're about to dive into this incredible world of dangerous sea voyages, powerful kings, and, believe it or not, the very first coins. We're going to see how these bustling ports and this brand new idea of money literally connected the world thousands of years ago. So, let's jump right in. Okay, just imagine this for a second. You're a sailor. You've just crossed these huge, vast oceans. Your ship is absolutely packed with valuable stuff. You're so close to your destination, but the last little bit of the trip, it's the most dangerous part. This quote you're seeing, it's from a Greek sailor from about 2,000 years ago. And man, it just perfectly captures that heart-pounding feeling. This wasn't just about business, it was a total high-stakes gamble.
So, where was this treacherous place he was talking about? It was the ancient port of Bari Gaza, which we know today as Bharuch in Gujarat. You got to understand, this port was a massive deal. It was this critical gateway, this bustling hub that basically plugged the Indian subcontinent into the rest of the world. Let's dig into what made it so important.
So the big question is, how on earth did they deal with this navigational nightmare? Well, the answer was brilliant and actually pretty simple. Local knowledge. The king himself went out and hired the best local fishermen, guys who knew every single current, every hidden rock, like the back of their hand. And just like that, this incredibly smart move turned a deadly passage into a super busy commercial highway.
Okay, so what kind of stuff was actually moving through this port? Honestly, the variety is just mind-blowing. We're talking Roman wine and European metals coming in, being traded for things like exotic plants from the Himalayas, beautiful ivory and fragrant perfumes going out. This was not your local farmer's market, okay? This was the center of a truly global supply chain. And this was 2,000 years ago, just incredible.
But it wasn't all just business and cargo. It was about people and relationships too. To kind of grease the wheels and stay on the king's good side, merchants would bring these really lavish gifts. And I'm not talking about a fruit basket here. Think vessels made of pure silver, fine wines, and even singing boys for entertainment. It's a really powerful reminder that back then, who you knew was just as important as what you were selling.
Now, with all this stuff flying back and forth, you could imagine things got complicated. You needed a better, more efficient way to pay for everything. And that brings us to a truly revolutionary invention, the coin.
I mean, it's the obvious question, right? How do you pay for a huge shipment of silk with a crate of wine? Yeah, you could barter, but that gets super complicated super fast. The solution? It was something that would change the world forever. You guessed it, the coin.
So let me introduce you to the punch-marked coin. This was one of the very first forms of currency in the Indian subcontinent, and forget everything you know about the coins in your wallet. These weren't perfectly round. They were usually these odd-shaped, kind of rectangular or square pieces of metal, and instead of faces or words, they were just stamped with different symbols. Each one of those little marks told a story. It might represent a king, a guild, or a whole region.
And here's a closer look. See those symbols? Each one was basically a stamp of approval, a mark of authenticity. It told you who made it, a ruler, a group of merchants. And this idea, this standardization of value, was an absolute game changer. It made trading over long distances so much easier and way more secure.
What's really amazing is that these punch-marked coins were used for about 500 years. 500 years. That's not just some random historical fact. It's proof. It's proof of a stable, sophisticated economy that was humming along for centuries.
But hold on, coins weren't the only way to do business. In a lot of places, wealth wasn't measured in shiny metal. It was measured in something much more, well, fundamental. The stuff you actually needed to live.
Yeah, once you get away from those huge international ports, life and trade looked very different. For most people, day-to-day business was still all about the direct exchange of goods. The system we call barter.
And check out this beautiful ancient poem from the Sangam period. It just paints such a vivid picture of this. It's telling the story of merchants on these long, tough journeys, trading the white paddy, that's rice, from their land for salt from another place. It's just such a powerful reminder of the very human side of all this, a world away from those big anonymous deals happening in the ports.
And this sculpture from Sanchi, it basically brings that poem to life, doesn't it? You can almost see those merchants, their carts piled high with goods, trying to make their way through a busy town. These carts, they were the absolute lifeblood of the local economy. They're what connected different villages and made sure everyone got what they needed, like salt and grain.
So what we're really seeing here are two different economic systems working at the same time, side by side. You've got the standardized coins for the big, anonymous, international trade, and then you've got this very personal, community-based system of barter for all the local stuff. And it was having both of these systems that made the ancient economy so amazing. It could be globally connected and locally strong all at once.
And all of this kind of brings us to one last thought. We've just seen how trade, in all its different forms, was this incredible force that built and connected ancient communities. So when we look at our own world today, with its cryptocurrencies and insane global supply chains, it really makes you wonder, right? What are the things that are truly connecting us, and what might be dividing us? Something to think about. Thanks for joining me.
Let's talk about what really made ancient cities work. Underneath the hustle and bustle, there was a hidden system running the whole show. Today, we're going to uncover that world, a world of amazing artisans, powerful guilds, and a system of control that was, well, both brilliant and brutal. Okay, let's get into it.
Take a look at this. This amazing sculpture is 2,500 years old, and it gives us this perfect little snapshot of a busy ancient city. But you know what you can't see here is the invisible engine making it all possible. The rules, the money, the organizations holding it all together.
So that's the big question, isn't it? How on earth do you organize thousands of craftspeople? How do you make sure the stuff they make is top quality? And how do you fund these huge operations without computers or spreadsheets? That's the puzzle we're going to try and solve.
To get to the bottom of this, we're going to zoom in on one absolutely incredible city, Mathura. It's basically the perfect case study for understanding how the machinery of an ancient metropolis actually worked.
First off, just wrap your head around this number. Mathura was a major important settlement for over 2,500 years. That kind of stability, that kind of longevity, it just doesn't happen by accident. It tells you that they were doing something very, very right.
So what was their secret sauce? Well, you've probably heard this before. Location, location, location. Mathura was perfectly placed, right at the intersection of two huge ancient trade routes. One went from the northwest to the east, the other from the north to the south. Being at that crossroads made it a natural magnet for people, for goods, and for ideas.
And because it was at the center of everything, Mathura became way more than just a pit stop for traders. It grew into this multifaceted powerhouse with a few different but totally connected identities.
See, Mathura's real power came from the fact that it was juggling all these roles at once. It was a massive commercial hub, famous for its amazing sculpture. It was also a political capital, the second most important city for the Krishna Empire. And on top of all that, it was a huge religious center for Buddhists, Jainas, and worshippers of Krishna. And these things weren't separate. They all fueled each other, creating this incredibly vibrant, dynamic city.
So we know Mathura was a hub for making stuff. But what kind of stuff exactly? What were the hot-ticket items that everyone wanted from Mathura's workshops? Let's take a closer look.
One of the most important things archaeologists have found is this stuff right here, Northern Black Polished Ware, or NBPW for short. Now trust me, this was not your grandma's pottery. This was luxury. This was a status symbol, and it shows just how skilled these artisans were.
Listen to how the source texts describe it. Metallic looking with a mirror-like shine. Think about that. They achieved this incredible finish by firing the clay at super high temperatures. It was a really advanced technique, and it made these pots and bowls highly sought after all over the place.
But it wasn't just pottery. Of course not. Textiles were another massive industry. And Mathura was a key link in this huge chain of cloth production that included other famous cities like Varanasi up in the north and Madurai way down in the south. So we've seen what they were making. But the really mind-blowing question is, how did they organize it all? The answer comes down to these incredibly powerful groups called shrenis.
So what's a shreni? The easiest way to think about it is like an ancient version of a guild or a trade association. But these weren't just casual clubs. No way. These were highly structured organizations where craftspeople and merchants teamed up to basically control their entire industry. And when I say they controlled everything, I mean everything. The whole production line, from start to finish.
They were in charge of training new artisans, they went out and sourced all the raw materials, they handled distributing the finished goods, and they even organized the trade routes. They were the backbone of the entire ancient economy.
But hang on, because here's where it gets even more amazing. The Shrenis had another function, one that sounds surprisingly modern. Get this, they also acted as banks.
The system was just brilliant. So, a wealthy person could deposit money with a Shreni. The Shreni would then take that money and invest it. And the interest, the return on that investment, was used to support important community institutions, like local monasteries. It was basically an ancient form of social impact investing, connecting business directly to the city's religious and cultural life. So cool.
Okay, for the last part of our puzzle, let's zoom all the way in. We've seen the big picture with the Shrenis. Now let's step onto the floor of an actual workshop. How is the day-to-day labor really managed?
And the reason we know so much about this is thanks to an incredible ancient document called the Arthashastra. You could think of it like a manual for running a kingdom, covering everything from economics to law. And it gives us a really detailed look at the rules for workshops that were run by the state.
And who was actually doing the work? The Arthashastra is super specific. It lists widows, young women with disabilities, nuns, even retired temple servants. In one sense, this was a kind of social safety net, giving jobs to women who might otherwise be vulnerable. But, and this is a big but, the conditions were incredibly strict. The rules were just brutal. You were paid based on how much you produced. But, and this is a direct quote from the text, if you didn't finish your work, you'd have to pay a fine, and your thumbs could be cut off. Let that sink in for a second. Fines, or even physical mutilation. That's the level of control we're talking about.
So you see these two sides of the same coin. On one hand, you've got this incredibly sophisticated system of organization, of trade, of community finance. And on the other hand, you've got this terrifyingly harsh system of control on the workshop floor. It really forces you to ask a question that's just as relevant today as it was 2,500 years ago. Where do you draw the line between organization and control? And what is the human cost of efficiency?
All right, let's dive into a puzzle that connects two ancient worlds you would never, ever expect to find in the same story. We're about to uncover a tale of global trade and incredible wealth from over 2,000 years ago, a story that might just change how you think about globalization itself. It all kicks off with these just a few broken pieces of pottery found on the coast of India. Now, they're etched with an ancient script from that area called Tamil Brahmi. But here's the twist. They tell a story that stretches for thousands and thousands of miles. So what if I told you these little shards are a direct link to the heart of the Roman Empire? Sounds impossible, right? Well, that's exactly the mystery we're unraveling today. Our story is centered on a place called Arkamadu, a coastal settlement in what is now Puducherry, India. But listen, 2,000 years ago, this was no sleepy village. You have to picture a bustling, thriving international port, a major hub where ships were constantly unloading goods from faraway lands. So, when archaeologists started digging here, they found some of the things you'd expect. And then they found something they absolutely did not. Mixed in with all the local stuff, they started unearthing pottery that had traveled all the way from the Mediterranean. This discovery, well, it changed everything. And the type of pottery they found tells such a cool story. First, they found amphorae. You can basically think of these as the shipping containers of the ancient world. They're these tall, double-handled jars that were perfect for transporting precious liquids like wine and olive oil across the seas. But then they found this, a retine ware. And folks, this is the smoking gun. This wasn't just some generic pottery from somewhere in the Mediterranean. No way. This is a very specific, stamped, red glazed style that we know for a fact was made in one single city in Italy. So boom, suddenly we have a direct physical link between this Indian port and a very specific spot in Roman Italy. But this is where the story gets even more interesting. Arakamedu wasn't just a drop-off point for Roman goods. The evidence shows it was a massive industrial center in its own right. It was a true workshop for the world. I mean, they dug up a massive brick structure that was almost certainly a warehouse for storing all these goods. They found huge tanks that were probably used for dyeing cloth, a huge industry. And they found tons of evidence that local artisans were making beads from semi-precious stones and even manufacturing glass. See, they weren't just buying things, they were making things. And this really shows you the incredible level of connection going on. It wasn't just about trading stuff. This was a real cultural exchange. Local potters in Archimedu actually started copying Roman designs and using them in their own pottery. You can literally see the influence of a faraway culture showing up in their local art. So this all brings up a pretty big question, doesn't it? Who exactly was on the other end of this incredibly long and complex trade route? Who had the kind of wealth and demand to power this whole operation? The answer, of course, was Rome. At the very same time that Archimedo was this buzzing port, Rome was becoming the absolute center of the known world, a city with a scale, power, and ambition the world had never seen before. And remember, we're not just talking about a city. This was the capital of one of the biggest empires in history. It controlled land all across Europe, North Africa, and West Asia. And an empire of that size, it has an insatiable appetite for resources, for luxury goods, for all the exotic things that came from places like India. You know, to really get the mindset of Rome at this time, you just have to hear this quote from Emperor Augustus, who was in charge right around this period. His whole ambition was to transform the city, to make it a monument to its own power. And let me tell you, that kind of transformation requires an unbelievable amount of wealth. And he did it. Augustus and the emperors that came after him built on a colossal scale. We're talking huge amphitheaters for public games, magnificent temples and palaces, and those massive aqueducts, total marvels of engineering that brought fresh water into the city. All of it, all of this grandeur, was fueled by the wealth from a global trade network that stretched all the way to Archimedu. So let's just pull all these threads together. What we're really looking at here is a truly ancient, connected world. It's a story where a tiny, almost insignificant-looking piece of pottery can tell a massive global story. I mean, just look at this. On one side, you have the humble little pottery shard found on an Indian beach. On the other, the monumental architecture of Imperial Rome. They seem like they're from two different worlds, but they are part of the exact same story. The wealth that built that aqueduct was generated by the very same trade that carried that piece of pottery to Archimedu. So the big takeaway here is this. We often think of globalization as some modern thing, a product of the internet and giant container ships. But it's not. This is the proof. A complex, interconnected global economy was already humming along 2,000 years ago. It's an ancient story, and it's written on fragments of pottery. And that leaves us with one final thought. If a discovery at one small coastal port in India can completely reshape how we see the ancient world, it just makes you wonder, right? What other incredible stories of ancient connections are still buried right beneath our feet, just waiting to be discovered?